Welcome to the 3026 Breakdown. I am your host, John Lee, and today I'm back with another awesome and information-packed edition of How I Watch Fights. This one I'm calling Closing the Gap with the MMA Prophet. For today's video, I sat down last week to talk with Greg, also known as the MMA Prophet, on Twitter and betmma.tips. Greg is one of the most successful new handicappers on the MMA scene, with multiple huge 10-plus unit wins on several events since he started tracking his bets at UFC 205 a couple months ago. The MMA Prophet is plus 48 units since UFC 202 for a real-world profit of $4,800. So you're definitely going to want to listen to this video and take notes, because the MMA Prophet is going to share a lot of tips to profitability. Pun intended. Like most handicappers, Greg started out training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and watching MMA fights during the Chuck Liddell era. But it wasn't until a bad breakup during a backpacking trip to New Zealand that he got really serious about picking winners late in 2016. When he returned home from New Zealand, his dad wanted him to stop betting, so he decided to match his bets, hoping that they would lose and that would be the end of Greg's gambling career. But rather than losing, Greg ended up cashing over 10 units that night and has been on a roll ever since. Greg watches fights on his laptop or phone and really focuses on stopping fights and rewinding to look for tendencies and openings. He said in the future, he hopes to even slow things down frame by frame to really look for small, minute details like footwork and head movement. One of the things I remember from the MMA Prophet's tweets was him once saying that if you're gambling on memory only, you're destined to be mediocre. This stood out to me because when I watch fights, especially when I'm rewatching a fight that I've already seen, I notice that it tends to go way differently than I remembered. You know, there tend to be a lot more moments for the guy who lost, there tend to be a lot more close calls, and there tends to be a lot of stuff that you just kind of filter out or delete, distort, or don't remember. So it's really, really important that you tape study and that you take tons of notes. We'll be talking about that on our next How I Watch Fights when I interview Mike Janes of betmmatips.com. The MMA Prophet believes in looking for and betting on the most likely outcome regardless of the odds. He doesn't subscribe to only betting on underdogs or only betting on favorites. Instead, he's looking for and betting on whatever he believes will be the most likely outcome. Greg only follows a few other handicappers. Our last guest, Dan Levy of the Half the Battle podcast, the Bookie Beatdown podcast guys, who hopefully I'll be able to interview at some point, and Luca Fury of Fury's Fight Picks podcast. He especially recommends Luca Fury, who he believes is far and away the best bettor in MMA, and he feels like he's learned the most from in terms of resources. More importantly than who you listen to, Greg recommends that you choose your counsel wisely. You want to make sure that you're aware of their biases, the things they're good at, the things they're bad at, and that you're not just making decisions based on the people you're following, because gambling is all about belief and all about confidence, and you want to make sure that you believe something rather than just going on what someone else is saying. So choose your counsel wisely. Don't just listen to any Tom, Dick, or Harry on Twitter. One thing that stood out when I was talking to the MMA Prophet is that when he's watching fights, he uses a very scientific method to his tape study. The first thing he's doing is looking to prove himself wrong. I think a lot of guys are doing the opposite and falling into what's known as the confirmation bias. If you've listened to me at all, you know I love those little biases and mental shortcuts that people tend to use that lead to wrong thinking. But the confirmation bias is basically when we look for evidence to support our previous hypothesis. So if I, for example, was looking to prove that Dominic Cruz was going to beat Cody Garbrandt, I could totally not pay enough attention to Cody Garbrandt's tape study and end up making a big bet on Dominic Cruz that I lost. Greg watches at least 3 fights from each fighter in a given matchup and looks for similar style matchups in their previous fights, as well as how the fighter listens to corners and makes adjustments. I thought this was a really, really smart little detail, because one of the things we're looking for is predictability. And if a fighter cannot listen to his corner or make adjustments, then you know that if they're not doing well, they're not going to be able to make the changes. And you can predict that if they start off badly in a fight, they're going to do badly. So if you see a slow starter, for example, and you know that he's someone who doesn't listen to his corners, Cowboy Cerrone, then you want to avoid betting on them because you kind of know if he's not going to start off well, then it's probably not going to turn around. And there's a lot of evidence for that in Cowboy Cerrone's career. Another thing that really stood out to me was the idea of the most likely outcome. The Prophet starts by trying to figure out what won't happen, what the least likely outcomes are. And we'll talk about this later when we talk about not props, which the MMA Prophet actually was the first person to explain to me, that are pretty interesting. So that's coming in just a few minutes at the end of this video. After he figures out the least likely outcome, he then uses a process of elimination to find the outcomes from least to most likely before looking for bets that cover as many situations as possible. The MMA Prophet talks a lot about insuring bets, or as much as you can, by trying to find sure things or locks, and he noted that obviously he understands there's no sure things or locks with gambling, but it's easier to say locks or sure things than to say sure things in terms of gambling, which means there's never a sure thing, and I completely agree. Ideally, you'd like to find a path to victory without any damage, but that's not always something you can find. But if you do see a likely outcome to victory without damage, that is something to really put a lot of units on, because that is the best possible outcome. That's really like the holy grail when you're doing these sort of logic-based, line-based, proof-style thinking that I think is really the strength of the MMA Prophet. One of the reasons I wanted to interview him was that his logic is always strong. He uses very strong proof-style logic, like if this happens, then this happens. And I am a big fan of the same. I have a math background, so speaking my language. Let's look at a bet that Greg cashed this weekend at UFC 207 that I tailed. The over 2.5 rounds prop in the TJ Dillashaw versus John Lineker fight. And he made a whole video about his logic for this bet, so I don't want to take too much time to go into it, but he basically started off by looking at the least likely outcomes, which were John Lineker getting the knockout, and then expanded from there. And if you look at it, it was unlikely that TJ was going to get a finish in this fight because John Lineker is just so ungodly tough, and it was also unlikely that Lineker was going to get a finish because TJ has good wrestling and good footwork. So the over 2.5 round prop, rather than trying to figure out who's going to win a decision, you can basically decide that the most likely outcome is that the fight is going to go to decision. So that leaves you with 3 basic opportunities to bet. You could bet TJ Dillashaw by decision, which would have won with better odds, but then you're kind of leaving yourself open to the judges getting it wrong and other stuff like that. John Lineker by decision, which, would have failed, or the bet that he ultimately ended up going with, that the fight goes to decision. Those are the kinds of insurance that he was mentioning. When you're looking for things that give you coverage for the most possible situations. He was covered if Lineker won the decision. He was covered if TJ won the decision. He was even covered if there was a late finish after 2:31 of the 3rd round. So a lot of different outcomes being covered with that bet, and that's really, to me, the idea of insurance. You want to cover as many different situations as possible so that most of the time you win. Another thing that's different about the way the MMA Prophet bets is his large number of plays, with as many as 15 bets per event, which have been responsible for his 10-plus unit wins. This is a really big contrast to our last guest, Dan Levy, who makes between 1 and 4 plays. But Greg has some pretty sound logic for why he makes so many plays. Greg believes in finding bets you are confident in rather than subscribing to a rigid set number of plays and using the number of units to ensure his other more speculative bets, as I mentioned earlier. So the big thing Greg looks for is 1 or 2 locks per event. And then he puts a big number of units on there, which then allows him some, they call them implied odds in poker. I come from a poker background too. That's where most of my gambling has been done over the years. And in poker, you have implied odds, right? Which is basically if you're chasing a draw in the river, your implied odds, if you raise or you put too much money in the pot, you're basically subscribing to the idea that the implied odds are that we can put this guy all in. So if I raise $1,200 on the flop, even if that's too big of a bet, if the guy stays in, my implied odds are good enough that I can keep chasing. Similar idea here in the finding the number of locks. The MMA Prophet believes his best skills are finding locks, or as close as you can realistically get, and parlaying them. I asked Greg what his best advice would be to beginning MMA bettors, and he said, start small, but treat it like it's big, which falls in line with something that I did before I started betting, which was to bet on paper for a few events. I got this idea from Tim Ferriss when he was writing about angel investing. He said that if you're going to think about angel investing beforehand, you should spend 2 years tracking companies on paper. So I'm currently about 18 months into tracking 12 angel investment companies on paper. Hopefully I'll be able to angel invest, in about 6 months. I think I've learned a lot, but I recommend you do the same thing with MMA betting. I did that for 3 or 4 events in a row and was consistently getting, some profit and making picks right before I actually started putting real money on that. You can also use a site like betmma.tips to make picks so you can see how you would do. Just be sure to let them know that you're not actually a handicapper. So just make your picks, but don't put in units or whatnot because you don't want to screw up the leaderboard when you're not actually betting. That's just being polite. I asked the MMA Prophet for a list of things he recommended staying away from, and he gave me the following. Number 1, betting with your heart or your dick. Here Greg gave the example of Robbie Lawler. People love Robbie Lawler, so they want to bet on him. Or Paige Van Zandt. They think Paige Van Zandt's hot, so they want to bet with her. Much like Dan Levy, who we talked about last week, the MMA Prophet also looks to bet on people with a foot out the door, like Cole Miller recently. He also looks for long layoffs, with some exceptions like the Michelle Watterson fight, bad heart or mental fortitude, which I think we talked about a lot on the first edition of How I Watch Fights, betting on people with poor fight IQ. This is like my number one thing. I just won't bet on fighters who have bad fight IQ. I just won't do it. I can't. It just makes me irrationally mad. I don't even have a great rationale for it in terms of losing money. I've won some money on stupid fighters, but it just makes me so irrationally mad that I just stay away from it now. Like, I just get so upset. He also avoids betting on people if they looked bad on the scale and missed weight, and betting on matchups that are coin flips. And this last point I really should have underlined and bolded, because I think a lot of times, especially with dog money, guys end up betting on coin flips. And when you're gambling in a sharp way, when you're treating this as an investment rather than as just throwing money on the board and seeing what's happening, you want to stay away from coin flips because you want to have an edge. You need to have a statistical edge to be able to consistently win in this. And again, in the next video, we'll talk about what the statistical edge could be, because Mike Janes breaks it down into exact percentages really nicely. The last piece of gold that I really wanted to share with you was when the MMA Prophet mentioned the idea of the not prop bet, which he said can be tied into your earlier research when you determine what the least likely outcome to occur was. So to use our TJ Dillashaw, John Lineker example from before, you would bet not John Lineker by KO or not TJ Dillashaw by KO or submission or whatever. And then you could parlay those with your other least likely outcomes. So, for example, you could have parlayed, Dominic Cruz by knockout with that, and a few other things that you thought were very unlikely to happen. And I think they get pretty even odds, but they are currently only offered on, I think, 1 or 2 sports books. So check with your book. But I definitely like the potential of the not prop. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that as you're doing your research and determining the least likely outcomes, going through your logical linear thinking, it's easy to come up with those knots and then throw them in a parlay. The MMA Prophet is one of the most successful new handicappers to hit the scene in 2016, with plus 38 units tracked since UFC 205. Tailing the Prophet is profitable, period. You can find Greg on Twitter at the MMA Prophet, on YouTube at the URL that's currently on your screen. YouTube is so annoying, it won't let us just change our things to proper channel things because you have to have a certain number of subscribers and then it's a review process. So dumb. Just give us a channel name. Let this be youtube.com/channel/MMA Prophet. So much easier. I don't have to put this ugly URL on the screen. But no, YouTube has to be difficult. And if you are serious about making money and you want to be profitable, be sure to tail Greg on betmma.tips. I've put his URL up here as well, so you can just copy it from the screen. You might be able to click on it. I'm not sure how that works. I haven't enabled links, so probably not. But be sure to tail him. You can get his bets right now while they're still free. I personally always check his bets before I make mine, and like I said, I tailed him on 2 bets last weekend, both of which cashed at UFC 207. So definitely check him out. He's one of the best handicappers out there. Super sharp guy and a super cool guy. I really, really enjoyed talking to him. He's one of my good friends on Twitter that I really like going back and forth with and shooting the shit. So definitely give him a follow and tail his bets if you want to make money. Thanks for watching, and be sure to check out our next How I Watch Fights with betmma.tips and MMA Tycoon founder Mike Janes. Everything you ever wanted to know about the statistics of MMA will be in that next video. Mike was super awesome, and I think I have to make it a 2-parter because I have one part that's just all stat stuff and another part that's more in line with some of the stuff we've been talking about in the last 2. So thank you, MMA Prophet, for sitting down with me. Thank you guys and girls for watching. Be sure to give me a thumbs up, retweet my video, give it a like on Twitter, and if you have a handicapper in mind who you'd like to see me interview for the next How I Watch Fights, leave me a comment right below this video. Thanks, and I'll talk to you guys next time.